Hello again, book lovers. Robert M. Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, the acclaimed guide to stress, stress-related diseases and coping. And that's what you get in that order, from the point of view of the chemistry underlying animal and human organisms, especially with regard to brains and nervous systems. Yes, it's quite technical. I don't think I'll ever read a book that mentions glucocorticoids quite so much ever again. But after the initial explanation, which goes into hormones, sympathetic nervous systems, etc., it gives you enough of a grounding to go plunging into the ever more interesting aspects of looking at what exactly stress is. Well, the title comes from the idea that a zebra is going to be pretty stressed if it's being chased by a lion, and we get explanations of the mechanisms that happen to the zebra, how different systems take over other systems temporarily, how the animal then copes with the stress, which might depend even on the personality of the animal. But basically the chemistry of it, the brain chemistry, the hormones, etc. And asks the question why, if in the case of a zebra, once the stressor has gone, the zebra begins to sort of cool down, we as humans uniquely seem to be able to carry stress with us and stay up at night worrying about things that we can't influence, for example. Sapolsky presents many findings of experiments, but he's very careful also to present alternative theories which are also backed up by science. Here's a footnote from page 66, just as an example. The careful reader may be confused at this point. If insulin regulates glucose uptake, why does it influence the amount of fat being stored in fat cells? For immensely complex reasons that I once understood for a few hours for a final exam, the storage of fat as triglycerides requires glucose uptake. So you get a sense of the tone of the book there. Yes, it's pretty heavy stuff, but it's nicely told, anecdotal in a lot of cases. There's the story of John Henryism, the guy who worked himself to death, going into type A, type B personalities. Some very interesting side avenues of medical history. We get to learn about Burke and Hare, the grave robbers. We get to learn that Peter Pan's author, J.M. Barrie, was a product of stress dwarfism. Is that right? Science says that stress can cause stunted growth. Well, there's a fascinating history to be read there. Can stress turn your hair white? That's another question that's answered in this book, which I should say is a good 500 pages long, with copious notes, some of which lead down other rabbit holes. And that was kind of the thing about this book. It began as a scientific chemical explanation, but if we look at the subsequent chapters, we'll see, for example, from chapter 8 on, there are 18 chapters, all very nicely sized and all absolutely full of information. But anyway, immunity, stress, disease is number 8. I should say I find all these fascinating. 9, stress and pain. Then you get stress and memory, stress and a good night's sleep. All these are full of questions and partial answers. Aging and death is next. Why is psychological stress stressful? And you can see from that kind of title, there's all kinds of toing and froing about. There might be a need for some stress in our lives. It might not be a good idea to be completely stress-free. Is stress connected to pregnancy cravings, for example? Well, we have an explanation for that in this book. However, the note, as so often, makes clear that it's conjecture. So I found this, all in all, quite a treasure trove. It ventures often into the philosophical, keeps things light in as much as a heavy tome like this can, has some interesting illustrations drawn from modern art, as well as Gary Larson cartoons and non-Gary Larson cartoons, which make nice points, and an anecdotal style. Now, first my big caveat, and second my two penneth on the philosophical element of it. Right, my big caveat, as I am what they call here in Spain an animalista, is the shocking amount of animal cruelty that was involved in getting a lot of these results. At the end of chapter 6 we almost get a confession. Let me read. Harlow and his work remain immensely controversial. The controversy arises from the nature of his experiments and variations on them, for example raising monkeys in complete social isolation in which they never see another living animal. These were brutal studies and they are often among the primary ones cited by those opposed to animal experimentation. Moreover, Harlow's scientific writing displayed an appalling callousness to the suffering of these animals. I remember as a student being moved to tears of rage by the savage indifference of his writing, says Mr. Sapolsky. But in the very next paragraph, but at the same time these studies have been extremely useful, and then there's another sort of hedgy excuse there. They've taught us the science of blah 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 blah. Well, that sounds cruel. There's a lot worse than that. Even the idea of, I don't know, we decided to inject some substance into a rat to make it feel depressed. Even that kind of, am I oversensitive? Am I crossing a line? Things have got a lot better apparently. They only give the rats, mildly heated floors to have to stress out about to learn whether they press levers or not. In any case, that's where a lot of this information has come from, unfortunately. It's interesting to learn about our real experiences of pleasures. For instance, there seems to be a lot in the anticipation of pleasure, and I'm sure the French have some proverb that will sum that idea up neatly. But then again, we also have studies on Norwegian parachutists. What do we learn from them? We learn that of course you get really stressed out just before the jump, but not only that, but quite a while before the jump, but then that stress time gets down to pretty minimal and you begin to take it in your stride. As with a lot of the animal experiments, you end up thinking, yeah, that's kind of obvious, wasn't it? Still, we've got to prove it. So let's measure testosterone in Nepali mountain walkers and discover, for example, that it's lowest testosterone. I kind of would have thought the opposite, but there you go. In any case, that's my caveat. I think times are changing. I'm opposed to animal experiments. I've heard the arguments, so don't shout them at me. So right, let's dig a little deeper and ask why, for example, if I'm reading how people can react psychologically to things and physically to things, to invading viruses, for example, or pieces of bad news, you dig down into the chemistry and the brain chemistry and the nerve endings and the hormones and the glucocorticoids, and the explanations at these deep levels begin to sound a little bit like Harry Potter magic. X turns into Y kind of decides how it's going to react. You read a passage like this, for example. This is on page 170. This is a clever tactic that viruses have evolved. Infect some cells, replicate, burst the cells open in the process, make the sort of mess of things that sets off all sorts of alarms in the immune system, and just as those activated immune cells are about to pounce, burrow into another round of cells. While the immune cells are cleaning up, the virus goes latent again. Next paragraph. The next clever thing that viruses have done, they don't reactivate at any old time. They wait until the immune system of the host organism is lousy and then gun for some quick rounds of replication. And when our immune system's often at their lousiest, you got it. It's been endlessly documented that latent viruses like herpes flare up during times of physical or psychological stress in all sorts of species. That's kind of the nub of the book. It's showing how stress it lies at the very heart of a lot of our woes and ailments. If you fancy replaying that again, do so. You could reread it in the book, and I challenge anyone to read that and not think that a virus has some kind of mind or a determination or a will. Everything's done in terms of like there's little creatures fighting battles and they all react to each other. There are descriptions of how these chemical biological changes will affect us even prenatally. And so that brought me round full circle really to how I'd heard of Sapolsky in the first place. He was mentioned a lot in Freedom Evolves, which is book review 54, if you'd like to read about that. An excellent book, which I'm still reflecting on quite a few months later, and led me into Sapolsky's work. The philosophical nugget at question here being, if you go down to the tiniest atom and you take the universe as it is now, can you predict the future of the universe? Is everything set out? Is everything determined? Sapolsky is on the side of, yes it is, there's nothing you can do about it, I don't care how many quarks and leptons you throw at me. The universe is following laws and it's going whatever way it's determined to go. Dennett's book is very entertaining and makes a brave effort to argue against this. But I'm kind of with Sapolsky, and it doesn't surprise me that he takes this view when you look at the experiments he's doing, the brain science. I was wondering if, for example, these hormones affect and trigger the other hormones by literally having very tiny hooks, which they get into some kind of gelatinous substance. Who knows? And even if they did, you could zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and find out how such an atom is repelled or attracted to another atom, and so on and so forth. You don't have to go that deep into it. Those are my own reflections. But you can see it's the kind of book that does give you a lot of food for thought. As I said, every chapter is worth reading. The first ones are more explanatory, some of them are more anecdotal. All of them explain the role of stress in the various aspects. And thankfully, the final chapter is called Managing Stress and gives some great tips, a lot of which we kind of already know if we pay attention. But as a nice topping to the previous 400 pages of insights. It made me realise how little I know about body chemistry, and yes, it does make me want to read more, and it makes me want to read more Sapolsky, even though I do shudder at some of the medical history that led us to get the results we've got. Though just as a final note, there's the story of another chemist who had a great idea about how antibiotics might help, and he was ignored for a long time. So I began to smugly think again, scientists, they're all the same. And to some degree I think Mr. Sapolsky would even agree with that. There's so many conflicting views and so many raging disputes going on. It's nicely, refreshingly honest as well. Our author tells you what the science is and doesn't seem to be pushing any, as I said, the philosophical add-on was mine, doesn't seem to be pushing a view. He's just telling you what's going on in the worlds of neurobiology and why zebras don't get ulcers.